Hi, good evening, and welcome to the final session in our Money Makeover series. Tonight, our focus will be on buy-to-let property. My name is Melissa Lawford. I'm the property correspondent at the Telegraph. I'd now like to welcome my guest, property investor and founder of Northeast Property Investment, Max Armstrong, who's joining us from Sunderland. Over the next 45 minutes, we will be picking Max's brains with all of your buy-to-let queries. Welcome, Max.
Hi, Melissa. Nice to see you.
I'm good, thank you. How are you? How are you this evening?
No, good. Looking forward to it.
Would you like to introduce yourself to everyone?
Yeah, thanks. So I'm Max Armstrong. I am the owner of Northeast Property Investment. I got into buy-to-let and property investment back in 2007, which was pretty much at the peak of the property investment boom of the sort of the 2000s. So it was an interesting time to come into things. I started my career in property management and lettings for a large investment firm up in Sunderland. Crazy times, a little bit like at the moment in a way. Actually, the prices were going up on a weekly basis, which is essentially what we're finding at the moment as well. And I think people at the time thought the prices were continually going to go up as well, which came crashing in for us in 2009 as a company where we stopped trading. So that sort of ended my career there for a while, and I moved into property sourcing for a large local landlord, and I did that for a number of years. I cut my teeth driving the streets of the Northeast, pricing refurbishments, going in, speaking to agents, finding out where was good to buy, areas to avoid, what to look for, building relationships. So it was a really good grounding. I set up an estate agency in 2015 with a valuer who had become a good friend. That's still going to this day, and that's going well. And then in 2016, set up a Northeast Property Investment, which essentially is a one-stop shop for buy-to-let investment for people who are probably 90% of our clients are remote from the region. So they're looking for sort of affordable, entry-level buy-to-let investments all under one roof. So it could be an element of property sourcing, refurbishment, lettings and management, accountancy advice, so we have accountants on hand, legal advice, insurance. So really everything for a sort of a full hands-off experience. And well forward 5 years to us having this tonight, and we've got about 100 landlords who we work with, and around about 350 properties that we manage on a daily basis. On a personal level, I have a couple of portfolios of my own, one that I own with my wife. It is a sort of an ongoing pension fund that we add to when we can. And then I have a slightly larger portfolio that I'm a little bit more aggressive with, that I have with a partner of mine, and we have plans over the next 5 years to double that. That's a bit about it.
That brings me on nicely to my first question, and I wanted to start with, is buy-to-let still profitable? What's your take?
It would be a short conversation if I said no. It is, and it can be, but it does come with caveats. And I think if you were looking at things from where they were 5 years ago, the market has certainly changed. I think, unfortunately, buy-to-let and landlords per se be an easy thing for governments to turn to for extra taxation. I think people have seen that with Section 24 when it was announced back in 2016. I think you may have mentioned Section 21 in relation to essentially strengthening tenants' rights as well. If you were to look at a lot of measures that have come in over the past 5 years, I think you mentioned the stamp duty surcharge as well, 3%. It's a drip effect that would remove some of the confidence from the market. But that said, it's not what we're seeing on a daily basis. We are busier at the moment than we ever have been with people wanting to get into buy-to-let investment. We're just finishing off our review of last year's figures for our landlords. And on average, net of management fees, our landlords are looking at a net return of around about 8.5% for last year. Compared to a lot of other investments, that has to be a good return. You're certainly not going to get that in the bank. Stock market's volatile, and a lot of people aren't comfortable with it anyway. And they like property, they like that it's tangible, And if you can get returns of anywhere sort of northwards of 7%, I think that has to be a good investment. I think I was reading your article last week, Melissa, where you were sort of highlighting the Northeast would possibly have returns of around 7.1% yield at some stage this year, which, that has to be a good use of your money. But it comes with caveats as well. It's not straightforward just to jump into buy to let. You have to put a few things in place before you get started. A couple of tips from. Sorry, go on.
No, you please give your tips, and I was going to move on to ask about tax efficiency. But if you've got profitable tips, please do share.
Well, the tax efficiency side of it as well. I think at the outset, go and get sound financial advice. Go and see an accountant. Get professional advice. That allows you to establish where you're going. Decide whether you want to be a landlord and an investor or a trader. So whether you're going to keep properties for investments or you're actually going to trade them to turn cash. That's quite difficult in the current market at the moment, but used to be quite a big consideration. And yeah, I think other things like, budget is hugely important. We would all like portfolios in Chelsea, but for most of us, that's just not going to happen. So our budget sort of drives us in the direction of where we can invest. The Northeast is quite an affordable entry-level buy-to-let area where you can invest. But if most of our clients are remote from the Northeast, you're going to have a group of people around you who can advise you. It's that dreaded saying, the power team, which is, I don't like as a saying, but essentially it's a relationship with local agents. It's a contractor who's going to carry out whatever element of refurbishment that you're going to need. A local solicitor, very important because, in our area up here, we have something that's quite unique to the Northeast called time-signed leases. Many solicitors from outside of the area don't quite understand the nuances of those, and that can cause complications. And then you need a relationship with a property management company or letting agent who you really trust. I think otherwise, you can end up the headline figures of what you've invested in don't actually materialize. If you're paying out for maintenance and additional repairs every month, it's not what it said on the tin.
And that, I think, leads us on quite nicely to the question that was overwhelmingly the most common of what everybody submitted, which is, what is the most tax efficient way to structure a buy-to-let investment? And particularly crucially, when is using a limited company structure worth it? Just a few examples our readers have sent in on this topic. One person asked, we've got a small portfolio of 6 properties. Is it worth putting them into a company structure? And others asking, how can you minimize tax on rental income if you're a higher rate taxpayer? Max, maybe you could start by outlining exactly what a limited company structure means in practical terms for landlords, and then who should consider them. Is there a threshold where when you have a certain number of properties, it makes much more financial sense to invest this way? And then what are the pros and cons of approaching it that way?
It's one of the fundamental questions that we get asked now as well when we're meeting new clients, which actually in 2015 it wasn't the case, but with Section 24 it certainly has become more prevalent. And whereas back in 2015 90% of people who came to us were buying in their own names or in joint names with their spouse, that's gone about face now. We're finding that the majority of people are looking to go down an incorporated setup, and it is really driven by tax efficiencies. The removal of mortgage interest relief for higher taxpayers, it's had a direct impact on people's bottom line. The 20% tax credit that is now available to you doesn't offset the additional tax that you're paying on the income. It also had a psychological impact for people, Melissa. A lot of chat saying, should we stay in buy-to-let? What are our options? We must go down the limited company route and start taking advantage of, paying lower levels of corporation tax at say 19%. It would seem, an absolute no-brainer to go along those routes, but it's not quite that straightforward. I think you mentioned someone with 6 properties who would be looking to go down to move across to incorporate and have a limited company setup. but it does come up with additional costs. With the stamp duty surcharge, you may well incur 3% charge on that. There's other capital gains implications that you would need to seek advice from your accountant. We have an accountant who works closely with us as a business. He comes from a property background as well, so he advises on all the complexities of tax. But if you're someone who's starting out on day one with plans to build a large portfolio, if you're a higher rate taxpayer, if you don't necessarily need to live on the income that your properties generate, so you can leave the profits in the business, it is certainly a more tax efficient way to go down the limited company route. So you can. Sorry, go on.
Sorry, is the general rule of thumb, if you're a basic rate taxpayer and you're not going to become a higher rate taxpayer as you expand your portfolio, limited company structure, there's no point in doing it?
Yes, it is, with a few exceptions. You can mitigate your tax as well. That if you have a spouse who's a lower band taxpayer, you can transfer properties across to them and pay at a lower rate. So everything really is predicated on what your own situation is and what you're looking to achieve. If you're, for example, wanting to introduce an element of gearing into your portfolio, you have to factor in that the amount of products that are available to you as a limited company are certainly not as many as available to a private individual. They're about 1% more expensive. There's more setup costs. There's legal costs. You may have to change from your current product, which you may not be able to do. So it's not quite as straightforward. You do have to plan out. Funnily enough, it's something I'm looking to do myself at the moment with mine and my wife's portfolio, which we were going to move to a limited company setup. I'm just trying to put off the inevitable tax bill that's going to come my way.
And could you just outline what that tax bill is when you set up a limited company and move properties into it? You effectively pay the stamp duty again.
Yes, you do. And if you've got an increase in value on your property, there'll be an element of capital gain on that. Now you can offset that with gift relief and also incorporation relief, but they're quite specific accountancy products, which I'm probably going to try and stay away from a little bit. They are available, and you can look into those for you. But some of the costs that you mentioned are the legal costs and the stamp duty costs as well.
Do you have a general rule of thumb for at what point a portfolio hits a certain size and then it makes sense to start thinking about limited company structure? I mean, is 6 properties perhaps ballpark when someone would start thinking about doing that, or should?
Yeah, I think you start at the outset. That's you go and seek financial advice from an accountant who will advise, discuss with you your plans, your personal tax situation, because there's sort of complexities that sit behind that as well that we may not know about your inheritance tax planning situation. There's inheritance tax benefits of being able to move shares to family members, etc., in a limited company setup. So it is quite a nuanced, complicated area. Like I say, if anybody wants to get in contact afterwards, we have an accountant who can answer questions, and we have a brochure that covers off some of the main points.
Okay, so the message is, if you're already owning a lot of properties, making the switch is pretty complicated and technically hard. But if you're starting out, it's something you should consider if you're thinking of making quite a large portfolio.
It is. Yeah.
That I think brings us on quite neatly to the next thing that I wanted to address. We've had a lot of questions from people who are thinking about investing in buy-to-let for the first time. Everything's getting more complicated for landlords than it used to be, but certainly, as you mentioned, no one's going to make any money if they keep their cash in the bank with interest rates where they are. One person asks, what is the minimum amount you need to start in buy-to-let property to get yields of 8% in the UK? Another person has £100,000 to invest and asks if buy-to-let is wise if they've got no maintenance skills or contacts. Someone else has got to spare £30,000. And another question, which as a renter myself I find particularly interesting, is if you're a first-time buyer, should you focus on bringing your first home or a buy-to-let? Max, how much money and experience do first-time investors need to start in buy-to-let, and how quickly can they expect to start getting their money back?
Yeah, good range of questions, and nuts and bolts stuff, isn't it? Really, you could go on Rightmove now, and you could do a search on the northeast, and you could find investment properties available to you for £15,000 to £25,000, and they would be advertised that they would rent at £400 a month. So you'd be thinking, wow, 15-20% return, this has to be a no-brainer. It's not quite as straightforward as that. They come with inherent issues, risks, void periods. What we say to people is that if you're looking for cash purchase in our area, which is pretty much the Scottish borders down to Teesside, you need to have around about £50,000 to play with. That's sufficient money to purchase the property, cover your buying costs, any stamp duty for anything over £40,000 at 3%, and also carry out an element of refurbishment. There's always an element of refurbishment and investment needed, well, at least in 90% of the cases up here. If you're looking to use a little bit of gearing and you have a mortgage approved and you've been working with a mortgage broker, for £15,000 to £20,000, you can buy a very solid investment in the northeast. I'm talking 3-bedroom, freehold, ex-local authority houses in working areas on main bus routes next to schools that'll generate you anywhere between 8 and 11% returns. And the period to do that is, sort of by the time you've found the property, gone through the conveyancing, carried out any required works and let it, is anywhere between 4 and 6 months. So figures-wise, that's all achievable. Would I go into an area and invest that I didn't know, that I didn't have contacts? I would be incredibly wary. I don't know the particular nuances of what a property is really worth in that area. I can check on Rightmove, I can check land registry, but I would rather have an actual feel for what a property is worth. So if I was looking to invest out of area, not going to sell our services and you'd say you must come to an EPI, but you could certainly team up with a property investment company, maybe with a mentor who can give you advice. If you've got time, visit the area, go and speak to local agents, start putting together your team. I always say to people who get in touch with us, please come and spend half a day in the area, because you're telling me that you may be comfortable with a house in a certain area, but when I actually take you to it, you're not quite as comfortable. And I just have a certain test when I go and view a house, is that if I took my wife to view that house with me, would she understand why I'm investing our money into that house? And if the answer is no, it's probably not the place to invest in.
You mentioned gearing. Could you just outline exactly what you mean by that and what first-time investors should think about if they're thinking about doing it?
Yeah, it's just using other people's money, which in our case is mortgage funds mainly, percent of the time, to make your money go further. So, we're taking out mortgages, we're putting in deposits, we're finding properties that are £80,000 that we can't buy for cash. So we're putting in a 25% deposit at £20,000. So we're using other people's money to buy something a bit better to give us more of a return on our initial investment.
And then a lot of people have asked us about strategies. So how landlords can find the balance between investing for capital growth and for income. A lot of people are asking about the pros and cons of holiday rentals, HMOs, student properties versus standard long-term rentals, and then also the differences between different property types. Should you buy flats or houses or new build? One reader's asked us, how should I set up the finances of property to maximize income? And I mean, so often as you're talking about, this comes down to location. And the $1 million question from another reader is, where do you think the highest yielding areas will be in the UK in 2021 and 2022? Max, I was wondering if you could talk us through a couple of your thoughts on the best strategies for investing and which property types and places offer the best opportunities.
I got you back.
Sorry, did you catch that? Sorry,
I got the majority of that. So over the past 5 years, there's been a nice mixture of growth in some of the areas such as Oxford, Cambridge, Bristol, Manchester, where you've had a lovely mixture of capital appreciation, very strong rents and everything else. Looking at things, they seem to be getting quite expensive, possibly not in line for everyone. I think if you're looking for yield and return and affordability, you're certainly looking towards the northeastern parts of the northwest to invest. I'm not even going to try and be objective. The northeast for me is going to be a good place to invest over the next 5 years. We've got some big ticket items happening up here. The government have their levelling up agenda, which is lovely. From living in Newcastle for years and years, it's what we need. Big capital infrastructure projects. We have Darlington Northern Treasury coming here. We also have the Tees Freeport, which are they're going to have a positive impact on the local housing market, and it's certainly worth looking to invest in those types of areas. I think strategy-wise, 5 years ago, people were coming to us mainly with two types of investment that they wanted to get into, which was the main one being the buy, refurbish, rent, refinance, and repeat model, which I think was taught on a lot of courses and was made to sound a lot easier than it actually is. That's not so easy in a buoyant market that we have now, because no one's really obliged to give you a huge amount of discount. You have to, you need to add some genuine value for a surveyor to go out and see an uplift on your property. And we also got a lot of people coming to us for HMOs as well. Again, with how the student market is at the moment, the uncertainty over COVID, new student blocks coming up, that's probably something again that I would take a step back from. We're spending a lot of time taking advantage of permitted development, working with commercial agents rather than normal high street residential agents at the moment. So we're looking for empty shops that aren't going to be opening up again. We're putting a change of use into them, so genuine added value. We've got a couple of examples at the moment. A beauty parlour that we're turning into a one-bedroom flat. We've got a large block of Victorian terrace that was used as a solicitor's office that, again, we've got permission to turn into a 6-bedroom HMO. So just being a little bit creative and working down that route can add some genuine value. But what we're spending most of our time on at the moment is we're really trying to insulate our rents and guarantee the rents for ourselves and our landlords. So we're doing a lot of work in relation to social housing, whether that's with large national housing associations, all the way down to what are called community interest companies. These are essentially, we source the properties, we become the property, and then we lease our properties on a long-term basis to these companies. And it can be anywhere for a period of 3 to 7 years on these leases. They're not as strong as a commercial lease, but they're certainly better than residential tenancy.
And are those returns that you get on those properties pretty much the same as standard letting, or do you take a little bit of a hit for your rent in exchange for the long-term guarantee?
No, it's the best of both worlds, actually. We get a little bit more capital uplift, and then we get an enhanced version of rent over a longer period. It takes a little bit longer at the outset to get right, and the actual level of refurbishment is sometimes a little bit more than you would do on a normal residential investment. But over the long run, which is what we're looking at, because we're looking at a sort of a 5-year strategy at the moment, because we don't know what's going to happen with interest rates, we don't know what's going to happen with inflation. But if we are going to have a level of inflation spike that people are talking about, we feel that being in property gives us a level of insulation against that. If we can tie our rents in for a period of 5 to 7 years, that seems sensible for us. So we're doing a lot of that type of work for our clients at the moment.
And for people listening tonight who maybe have one property or are thinking about investing, buying maybe one property or two, and are coming at this on quite a small scale, is that something people can do just by themselves, or do you have to be going to a local authority through an agent or through a company? Is it something that can be a little bit DIY or not at all?
No, you can do it. You can do it yourself. It's easy to do it. Like I say, there's a huge amount of what we would call community interest companies who are only looking for one or two houses, and they're providing a function that the councils would used to provide. It could be short-term homelessness. And they need small landlords to fulfill that because they have no other access to buy these properties. So it's a way to get some, some security over the medium term. I think what we've also noticed over the past for people as well is there's a lot more activity into holiday lets. It's something that we've never been involved with previously, but I think people are starting to look at that as a way to take some benefits of taxation benefits of having a business, because it is seen more of a business than a property investment.
And particularly as well with the sort of second, well, I don't really like the word staycation, but we're certainly seeing a boom in British holiday bookings last summer and this, I know. Could you talk a little bit, that's come directly from coronavirus and the pandemic. I was interested in what you were saying about developing, unused shops and spaces on high streets. Could you talk about how certain strategies or the new opportunities that are coming from the pandemic?
There's a whole raft of them. I think, but what we're trying to do is what we're trying to avoid is doing what everyone else is doing, which is basically dealing with high street estate agents, your traditional sort of property investment. Where it needs to work, I think, in a market like we have at the moment after COVID, which is a very buoyant market, is you need to be finding properties that are direct with the vendor. So we've actually become very traditional in what we're doing at the moment. We're sending out a huge amount of direct marketing, a lot of leaflet, a lot of using of land registry, checking for sale boards that have been up for a while, using land registry to ascertain who the landlord is and writing to them with proposals so we can get some genuine discount. Because what we're conscious of at the moment is that there's a real spike in property prices, which I think you've alluded to in some of your recent articles as well. What we don't want to be doing is buying at an inflated rate at the moment and then paying the price for that in a year's time when we have furlough drops out and we have various other changes that are going to come in 2022. So strategy-wise, that's our sort of consideration rather than just strategy.
And when we're talking about strategies, I think it's important that we also talk about exit strategies. A lot of our readers have written in asking for advice on navigating inheritance tax with properties, and everyone's very aware that future changes to capital gains tax are highly likely. One reader is 88 and has been a landlord for more than 30 years and asks, is there a tax efficient way to exit buy-to-let property? Max, what are the common pitfalls of exiting the sector, and how can investors start early to avoid them when they do eventually leave?
I think you've answered your own question in a way. It's all about timing. You need to give yourself as much time as possible. The biggest pitfall is leaving things at such a stage where you are leaving yourself open to large increases in property values that generate a CGT bill for you. If you have a number of properties, what you want to be doing is using your capital allowances to over a period of a number of years to minimize your tax bill. So you need to factor that in. You need to have a plan of when you're looking to exit, what allowances you can use, and when you need to start. You need to consider, are you going to be selling your properties on the open market? Because if they're tenant at the moment, you're going to have to serve notice. That's not quite as straightforward as we know with what's happening with Section 21, and if the tenants don't want to leave at the moment. We've got the extension of the eviction ban as well, which is going on until the end of May, and my gut feeling is that will actually stay in place until towards the end of the year. So you need to give yourself as much time as you can to get your affairs in order. If you have inheritance tax issues, trust issues as well, you need to work in conjunction with your accountants are aligned.
With doing something like working with your capital gains allowances, I think that's about 12,500 a year. Would you advise sort of, I don't know, drip feeding might be the wrong term, but basically don't do it all at once. You need to do it slowly over a period of years if you want to maximize your capital gains tax relief.
Without a doubt, yeah. I think it's 12,300 at the moment, isn't it? And, yeah, stagger that in over as many years as possible, just to, take advantage of it. Why would you not want to?
Mm-hmm. And then my final question before we move on to the questions in the chat bar. We touched on capital gains tax. You've touched on things like the furlough scheme ending. There's so much that's likely to change for landlords in the quite near future. People have also asked us about changes to energy performance certificate requirements and how you can prepare for interest rate rises and inflation, which you touched on earlier. Max, how much do you think the landscape is going to change for buy-to-let landlords going forwards, and what do investors need to be preparing for?
Yeah, I think, again, you've touched on the majority of the points there, Melissa. I don't think the government are going to ease off on landlords. We're already hearing about the possible changes to CGT to bring them in line with marginal rates of tax, the extensions to the tenant ban, et cetera, et cetera. So it does seem to be that there's, that's going to be an ongoing thing that we need to consider. The main one, actually, that you mentioned just before is the EPC situation. I think that's a genuine concern. Bringing everything to an E level for, especially on older properties, was quite a capital expenditure for some of our landlords. It necessitated new boilers, replacement windows, insulation. It's actually quite a significant jump to go from an E to a C. And I would suggest that if you have properties at the moment and you have a copy of your EPC, have a new one done, have a look what measures you may need to take, because people are talking about 2030 and that, that 9 years away, but that's not too long in property. You may need to start saving, or you may need to start looking at other opportunities to do something and dispose of that property. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to rent it.
Let's go to some of the questions in the chat bar, and one which we've touched on a little bit, and it's, I don't know, everyone has their own predictions and nobody ever really wants to talk too much about them because they get held to account. But Matt Morris has asked, nationwide, would you anticipate a drop in house prices over the next 12 to 36 months? You've talked a lot about how inflated house prices are at the moment. You don't have to put a number on what you think is going to happen to house prices, but what is your feeling for how the market's going to respond to the aftershocks of the pandemic in the next year or two?
Yeah. I was reading an article, funnily enough, the other day from Savills, where they were sort of suggesting that there was going to be year-on-year growth of around about 4%. I think that seems incredibly optimistic. Been speaking to a lot of local estate agents up here, and we feel that certainly by Q1 of 2022, assuming furlough finishes in September, that we will see a drop in prices starting to filter through then, as unfortunately people lose their jobs and the market just becomes a lot less buoyant. I think at the moment we're certainly it would not surprise me to see a drop of somewhere between 5 and 10%.
That's big. Are there areas of the market that you think will be more exposed and more insulated than others in terms of price movements?
Yeah. It is big. It's big numbers percentage-wise, but actually where we are here, where average prices are a lot lower, it's actually within the sort of parameters of historically being acceptable. It's not unusual. House prices haven't changed a huge amount actually since we came out of sort of 2008, 2009, where we had the initial drop off and then a very steady, recovery path in the northeast. So I think although we may experience a little bit of a shock here, I think it won't be, it won't be catastrophic.
And then next question from Mark Torres. He's asked, what are your views on student lets versus standard residential? It strikes me, that's a way that landlords can get this sort of guaranteed tenant demand in cities that also have great employment prospects. Could you talk about the pros and cons of student lets?
I think if you can get into student lets in some of the red brick university towns, and you can afford to do that, you will find that you can have very good, solid, noticeable income on an ongoing basis. Where we are in just up the road in Newcastle, 6-7 bedroom houses producing 35,000 pounds a year in rent. It's a good investment. This year it's slightly skewed things because there aren't many students here. There's a couple of considerations there. For a lot of people, it's expensive. It's quite a mature market. People have been buying student properties in a lot of these university towns for quite a few decades now, and it's not necessarily a cheap thing to be getting into. You're trying to buy a student property in areas of Bristol and Clifton and everything else. You're not going to get much change from £500,000 and probably quite a bit more than that. But if you can afford to, and you can get a large enough HMO, or even if you want to go slightly smaller and buy even a flat for your son or your daughter if they're going to university, the returns are, because you're on a room by room basis, noticeably different than what you would get on a standard AST. So yeah, certainly worth considering. Again, a few things to factor in there. Article 4 areas in some of these cities in relation to granting new HMO licenses. And also just to be cautious of the amount of oversupply of student properties with some of the new build flats that have been going up over the past 10 years.
We've talked before about how different university cities have different levels of oversupply. And that is very closely tied to build to rent as well, which particularly massively expanding in London at the moment. How much of a threat is purpose-built rental accommodation, both in the student sector and in wider buy-to-let? Does it matter? Should landlords be worried about the competition or not? Is it a different market altogether?
I can only speak from my own experience up in the Northeast. It has had a direct impact on it's moved the market for what students are looking for where we are. A lot of first-year students who are coming to universities are looking for the modern purpose-built unit with the gyms and the concierge and everything else, and the more traditional sort of jump straight into the 6 or 7 bedroom Victorian terrace isn't actually happening. So we're finding a lot of landlords are stuck with these large houses that actually, aside from student properties, that they have very limited use. Now, you can change them into normal residential HMOs for professionals and everything else. But again, that only works in certain parts of the country. In lots of parts of the country, in sort of secondary towns in the north, there just isn't the demand, that professional class of people who are looking to share a 8 or 9 bedroom HMO.
And then I think final question, this one's from Colin Plank. He's asked, what about the emerging problems relating to cladding, especially in terms of freehold versus leasehold? I think this is an interesting question for buy-to-let, especially as landlords are quite often purchasing in cash, and cladding problems come up mostly when people are trying to get mortgages and they can't get lending. But if someone's purchasing cash, then perhaps, I don't know, it's not something they're necessarily as aware of. Is the cladding crisis affecting landlords in the Northeast in any way? And do you have any thoughts on what prospective investors ought to prepare for?
It hasn't impacted on us directly yet as a company, and it's not something we've had any direct involvement with. My heart goes out to people who are living in these leasehold properties, and I think they've been strung out to dry by the government a little bit on this. I think expecting them to pick up the bills for developers not putting on the correct cladding at the outset, and then the likes of Zurich and other companies who were involved in signing off on these properties is, personally, I think it's absolutely disgusting. All I can recommend is just to use a local solicitor if you're buying a leasehold property, ask them to check this thoroughly, negate any potential risk that you have at the outset. You don't want to be buying somewhere where you're left liable for large costs on big ticket items such as cladding, lifts, windows, and everything else that you can be exposed to on these leasehold type arrangements.
Thank you very much. I think that is all that we've got time for this evening. A huge thanks to you, Max, and to our audience for watching us. I hope we've helped you to navigate through the thorny areas of your personal finances as we cross into the new financial year. It's been a pleasure. Max, thank you very much, and good evening, everyone.
Good night.